There is a kind of white that does not belong in a wheat field. Not the white of hail. Hail comes fast, ruins what it touches, and disappears into the dirt. Not the white of dust. Dust means wind, and wind is something a plains farmer learns to live with. This white stays. It lies on the rows like flour shaken from a sack. It gathers in the low places. It dries into a crust that snaps under a boot heel. And when the sun hits it, it looks almost clean. That is what makes it frightening, because it is not clean. It is salt. And when salt climbs to the top of a field, it means the field is no longer just thirsty. It is turning against the roots. For most farmers on the high plains, that color was a verdict. Once the salt showed itself, the land was not sick anymore. It was condemned. This is the story of the man who refused to farm by that verdict. Red Draw was not a town so much as a bend in the road, a grain elevator, a church, and a few dozen farmhouses spread across the hard western edge of Kansas. Rain came badly there. Some years it came all at once. Some years it came as a rumor. A good season might give the county 19 inches, and nobody trusted all 19 until the wheat was in the bin. For decades, the farms around Red Draw survived on dry land wheat, milo, and caution. The older men could read a sky the way other men read a newspaper. They knew when a cloud had rain in it, and when it was only passing over to make you angry. Then the water project arrived. It had a clean name, the Prairie Bend Irrigation District, and the kind of promise that makes bankers smile before farmers do. Federal engineers mapped canals across the flats. Pump stations were built along a branch of the Cimarron. Shallow wells were tied into the delivery system. Plan was simple enough to sound harmless. Bring water to dry ground. Grow what dry ground could never grow. Turn risk into production. And for a while, that is exactly what happened. Wheat fields that had once made 18 bushels an acre began making 55, then 60. Some men put in corn and pulled 100 bushels out of soil their fathers had considered too dry for anything but wheat and stubbornness. Alfalfa came in green and heavy. New pivots turned across fields like giant clock hands. Land prices jumped. Notes were signed. Machinery dealers ordered inventory before they had buyers because everyone believed buyers were coming. The county looked like it had found a future. What it had actually found was a clock. Every gallon that came through the irrigation district carried minerals. Not enough to alarm anyone, not enough to taste in a glass, but enough. The river had picked up calcium, sodium, sulfate, chloride, and all the invisible residue of stone and old seabed on its way across the plains. The wells added their own burden. The water spread across the fields. The crop drank part of it. The wind and heat took the rest. But the minerals stayed. One irrigation left almost nothing. A season left a trace. 10 seasons left a system of debt beneath the soil. The field kept no books until it was too late. At the same time, the water table began to rise. Before irrigation, groundwater in the low ground south of Red Draw sat deep enough that roots never touched it. After years of canals, leaks, flood sets, and pivots, it moved upward. 30 feet became 20. 20 became 12. In some pockets, the wet layer sat within 7 feet of the surface. That is when the land began lifting poison out of itself. Water moves upward through soil the way kerosene climbs a lamp wick. It rises through small pores. It carries dissolved salt with it. At the surface, the water leaves. The salt remains. The first white stains showed up in 1969 on the south end of the district, where the ground sagged and water had nowhere else to go. A few acres, a few pale seams along the rows. The district men called it mineral bloom. The county agronomist said a wet spring might push it down. The wet spring came. The white did not leave. By 1973, whole patches of field looked as if someone had dusted them with ground bone. Seedlings emerged, made a few inches of brave green, then yellowed from the tips inward. The roots were not failing to find water. The salt was stealing the water out of them. By 1976, nearly 2,400 acres in the Red Draw lowlands had visible salt injury. Some made half a crop, some made no crop. On the worst ground, a man could drag his boot across the surface and kick up white powder in July. The official answer was water. More water. Flush the salts downward, the experts said. Leach the profile. Use gypsum where sodium is high. Push the contamination below the root zone and let drainage carry it away. There was only one problem. There was no drainage. The project had been built to bring water in. It had not been built to take bad water out. Every attempt to wash the salts downward raised the water table higher. The higher it rose, the more salt the ground wicked back up. The cure fed the disease. The more salt the ground wicked back up. The cure fed the disease. By the late 70s, farm auctions became common enough that people stopped dressing for them. Families who had borrowed against irrigated land watched that same land lose nearly all of its value. Parcels that had once brought $300 an acre could not find a buyer at $60. Pivots stood still over white ground. Farmhouses went dark. Dogs disappeared from yards. The elevator manager said you could tell which families were leaving by the way their trucks sat loaded for weeks before the sale. The Red Draw Extension Office wrote a plain sentence in a district report that year. Severely salinized acreage in the lower basin is not economically recoverable under existing conditions. Not economically recoverable. Farmers understood the softer words around that sentence. They heard the hard center. Dead. Everyone in the worst strip left or rented their good acres somewhere else. Everyone except Caleb Rusk. Caleb was 58, narrow-shouldered, sun-cut, and quieter than people liked. He farmed 280 acres on the lowest shelf of the basin, land his wife Ruth had inherited from her mother. He had never fully trusted the irrigation district, even when it made him money. He used the water because a man with a note at the bank uses what he can. But he never stopped walking his fields after a set, touching the soil with his fingers, smelling it, asking what it had taken and what it had kept. When the white crust reached his south quarter, his neighbors told him to quit before the bank made the decision for him. Caleb did not quit. He took a jar of the white soil, drove 80 miles to the State College Library, and started reading. Not the new bulletins first. Those all told him the same thing: flush, amend, drain. He wanted older work, stranger work, work from places that had lived with salt longer than Kansas had lived with pivots. He read about irrigated valleys in North Africa, old river systems in Central Asia, reclaimed ground in Australia, and dry farms that had failed because they tried to wash out what had no place to go. Late on the second evening, he found the sentence that changed his question. Some saline soils can be bypassed rather than remediated if a separate root zone is established above the contaminated layer. Bypassed, not cured, not washed, not forgiven. Bypassed. That word stayed with him all the way home. Found Red Draw was asking how to fix the poison soil. Caleb began asking something smaller and more dangerous. What if the crop never had to touch it? His worst field was 36 acres, a flat basin where the salt crust had grown thick enough that rainwater sat on top of it before soaking through. No wheat had survived there for 2 years. In October, Caleb began covering it. First came wheat straw. He drove an old flatbed from farm to farm after harvest, asking for bales nobody wanted. Straw that would have been burned. Straw left in stacks too weathered to sell. Straw packed loose from broken bales around other men's sheds. He hauled until the shocks in the truck sagged. Then came manure. A feedlot outside Plain City had a mountain of it, and a manager who was happy to let someone else solve the problem. Caleb loaded it, drove it home, spread it over the straw, and went back for more. He did that for weeks. The smell reached the county road before the field did. People laughed because it was easier than admitting they were watching a man spend himself against a thing they feared. At the co-op, one farmer said Caleb was trying to bury a corpse with barn trash. Marvin Keel, who sold irrigation parts and had made a good living telling men that water solved problems, said it louder. "Salt ground is finished," Marvin told anyone who would listen. "Putting manure on it just makes dead ground stink." The county agronomist came out in November. His name was Peter Voss, and he was not cruel. He was careful, which in a desperate place can feel worse. He stood at the edge of Caleb's field with a clipboard and watched the wind move loose straw across the dark manure. "Your surface reading is above 7.5, Peter said. "That is lethal for wheat. Even if you make a bed on top, the salts will wick into it. You may get a year, maybe 2. Caleb pushed his cap back. How far will salt wick through good compost? Peter hesitated. Less than through silt loam, larger pores, less continuous rise. How much less? Maybe 4 inches, maybe 6. It depends. Caleb looked out at the field. Then I need more than 6 inches that roots can live in. Peter lowered the clipboard. Caleb, you are talking about building soil, improving soil, building it, across 36 acres. Caleb nodded. That is what the field is missing. That winter, Caleb did not plant. That was the hardest part for people to understand. A farmer who does not plant looks like a man who has surrendered. Caleb had not surrendered. He was waiting for the field to become something else. The straw softened. The manure heated. Rain moved through the pile and came out brown at the bottom. Earthworms appeared at the edges first, then farther in. By spring, the surface was no longer straw and manure exactly. It was a dark, fibrous mat with weight to it. Caleb added more. Spoiled hay from a dairy barn, cotton burrs from a gin 2 counties south. More straw after another harvest. More manure whenever the feedlot loader was free. By the second fall, the layer was nearly 18 inches deep in places. It was uneven, ugly, and alive. Then Caleb planted rye, not for harvest, not for money, for a verdict of his own. Rye would tell him what the experts could not. If the roots went down and burned, the salt was climbing too high. If the roots stayed clean, he had not healed the old field, but he had made a new one above it. The rye came up thin. Caleb watched it the way a man watches a sick child breathe. Every morning before breakfast he walked the rows. He looked for yellow tips. He scraped back the surface and checked the dampness. He dug plants with his pocket knife and washed the roots in a coffee can. In December, after a week of hard wind and no rain, he pulled one rye plant from the middle of the basin. The roots hung white. They had gone down 10 inches through the dark layer and stopped above the salt. No burn, no blackening, no bitter crust on the fibers. Caleb stood in a dead field holding a living root. For the first time in years, he smiled where nobody could see it. But a test is not a crop. A green cover in winter does not pay a note at the bank. The next spring, Caleb plowed the rye into the layer and planted wheat. The neighbors expected the field to fail by June. It did not. The wheat was not beautiful. It was uneven, short in places, pale where the organic layer was thin. But it lived. At harvest, Caleb cut 29 bushels an acre off ground that had made 0 for 3 straight seasons. 29 was not a miracle yield. That was why it mattered. A miracle can be dismissed. 29 bushels can be weighed. Caleb sold the wheat, paid what he could, and put the rest back into hauling. More waste, more cover crops, more patient work that looked foolish until the scale ticket came back. The next year, the field made 38. The year after that, 46. By then, the old white crust was still under the field. Caleb knew it. Peter Voss knew it. Anyone with a shovel could see it. Dig through the dark layer, and the spade hit the pale mineral soil beneath, still sharp with salt, still hostile, still there. That was the strange power of Caleb's idea. He had not removed the poison. He had built a floor above it. Roots lived in the floor. Rain stayed in the floor. Worms opened the floor. Rye roots deepened it. Straw fed it. Manure warmed it. Every season made it more like soil and less like an experiment. By 1982, Caleb had converted every field he owned in strips, 30 to 40 acres at a time. From the air, his farm looked like a mistake in the landscape. Around it lay the pale, abandoned basins of red draw, white and tan and empty. In the middle of them stood 280 acres of green. A crop-dusting pilot was the first to say it in town. "Rusk's place looks like somebody laid a rug over a salt pan." That sentence did what science had not. It made people drive out and look. Some came to laugh again. Some came because their own land was starting to whiten. Some came because they needed to see whether a field could be dead underneath and alive on top. Peter Voss came back with a soil probe and 2 graduate students. They pushed the probe through the original 36-acre field. The core came up like a layered cake. Dark, crumbly organic soil on top, a hard, pale line below it, saline mineral soil underneath that still tested near 8. The dark layer tested under 1.5, safe for wheat. One student said, "The salt is still there." Caleb laughed once. "That's the part everybody keeps missing. I did not make the salt disappear." Peter held the soil core in both hands. "You separated the crop from the verdict." Caleb liked that. He never said so. Ands. "You separated the crop from the verdict." Caleb liked that. He'd never said so. Peter wrote a bulletin the next year that described the system in dry language. Raised organic root zone construction over severe saline subsoil. It was not a glamorous name. But it traveled. Extension agents from other counties asked for copies. A few farmers with smaller salt patches tried it on 10 acres, then 20. Most did not have Caleb's patience. Some made the layer too thin and failed. Some stopped adding material and watched salt creep upward through weak spots. But the ones who built it deep and maintained it saw the same thing Caleb had seen. The old soil could remain ruined. The new soil could still work. In 1986, Marvin Keel came back through Red Draw. His irrigation parts business had closed after too many customers left and too many notes went unpaid. He had moved to Wichita and found work selling pump motors for factories. On the way to visit his sister, he drove the county road past the old salt strip. Most of it looked exactly as he remembered. Empty pivots, white flats, fence posts leaning in alkali dust. Then he reached Caleb's place. The wheat stood dark and heavy enough to move in waves. Not the thin, desperate green of a lucky year. Real wheat. Full heads. Even color. A field that did not look rescued so much as remade. Marvin parked beside the barn. Caleb was greasing a bearing on an old drill when Marvin walked in. For a moment neither man spoke. The barn smelled of oil, dust, and the sweet rot of composted straw. Marvin looked toward the fields. "I said you were wasting your life out there." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag. "You did." "I said salt ground was finished." "You said that too." Marvin swallowed. "I was wrong." Caleb did not make him say it twice. They walked out to the edge of the first field, the one everybody had called dead. Caleb knelt, pushed his fingers into the dark surface, and lifted a handful of soil. "This was feedlot waste," he said, "and burned straw, and moldy hay." Moldy hay. Things people wanted gone. He let the soil crumble through his palm. The old ground is still below it, mean as ever. But roots don't ask what is under them if they already have enough above them. Marvin stared across the wheat. "How did you know?" Caleb shook his head. "I didn't. I just knew the question was wrong. They kept asking how to clean the salt out of the field. I asked how to keep the roots away from it." That was Caleb's gift. Not rebellion, not genius in the way people say genius when they do not understand labor. He had simply refused the first question everybody handed him. The district wanted drainage. The experts wanted chemistry. The bankers wanted surrender before effort. Caleb gave effort before proof. And slowly, the proof grew. He farmed until his knees made climbing a tractor harder than arguing with an agronomist. His daughter Miriam took over the place in the late 90s. She had grown up in the passenger seat of the flatbed, counting bales, breathing feedlot dust, and learning that soil was not a thing you owned. It was a thing you kept making. By then, the state had added organic root zone building to its salinity guidance as a limited but real option for fields where drainage was too expensive or impossible. Caleb's farm was the case everybody mentioned, even when they disagreed about how practical it was. Because nobody could argue with the fields. The original 36 acres, the basin that once wore a white crust in summer, carried more than 2 feet of built soil by the time Caleb died. The salt below it still tested high. It had not repented. It had not gone away. But above it, wheat kept growing. Miriam still adds straw after harvest. Her son adds manure from a feedlot that now charges for loading because too many people learned what waste can become. Some years they plant rye, some years barley. Some years they leave a cover mix standing through winter, just to feed the layer that feeds everything else. They do not add because the field is empty. They add because the field is alive. That is the lesson Reddraw never forgot, even if most of the abandoned acres stayed abandoned. Sometimes a poisoned thing cannot be cured from the inside. Sometimes the answer is not to dig the poison out, or wash it away, or wait for someone with a larger machine and a larger promise. Sometimes the answer is to build a living place where the poison cannot reach. Caleb Rusk did not defeat the salt by making it vanish. He defeated it by giving the roots somewhere else to go. The salt stayed below. The wheat kept rising.